Wyoming Territory, 1875. The jagged silhouette of the Tetons carved a harsh line against the amber sunset as Yates Irving guided his horse along the rutted trail toward Jackson's Hollow. 3 years riding for the rocking M had hardened his body but not his spirit. At 25, he still believed there was beauty to be found in this unforgiving land, though he kept such sentiments to himself. Out here, a man survived by staying alert and keeping his emotions buried deep, a lesson learned watching companions fall to bullets, blizzards, and broken hearts. No place for putting down roots, Yates muttered to his palomino as they crested the ridge overlooking the settlement below. A collection of wooden structures, general store, saloon, smithy, and a dozen homes, huddled against the wilderness as if for protection. Beyond them sprawled the Whitman Ranch, where he was headed to deliver a message from his boss. Yates adjusted his cream-colored Stetson and nudged his horse forward. He'd learned early that attachment was dangerous in Wyoming. His parents' homestead raid taught him at 16 that loving something meant having something to lose. Better to drift with the seasons, taking work where he could find it, keeping conversations shallow and farewells brief. The cowboy way suited him, or so he told himself on cold nights when loneliness crept beneath his blanket like a mountain chill. The trail down to Jackson's Hollow twisted sharply, forcing him to focus on the treacherous descent rather than the unsettling emptiness that always greeted him when reaching civilization. By the time he reached level ground, the settlement's lamps were flickering to life against the gathering dusk. The Whitman Ranch house stood apart from town, a substantial two-story structure with a wide porch and smoke curling from its stone chimney. As Yates approached, a young woman stepped out onto the porch, her figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from inside. Something about her posture, straight-backed but somehow cautious, caught his attention. "Evening, ma'am," he called, removing his hat as he reined in his horse. "I've got a message for Mr. Whitman from Maxwell Roberts over at the Rocking M." She stepped forward into the light, and Yates felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. She was perhaps 21 or 22, with honey-blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun, though wisps had escaped to frame a face of delicate features. Her blue calico dress was plain but well-fitted, revealing a slender waist and gentle curves. What struck him most were her eyes, large and the color of summer sage, but holding shadows deeper than her years should permit. "My father isn't here," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite her apparent youth. "I'm June Whitman. I can take the message if it's urgent." Yates swung down from his saddle, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. Maxwell wanted to discuss combining herds for the drive north. "Says there's safety in numbers with the rustling that's been happening." He handed her the sealed note. "I'm Yates Irving. Been riding with the Rocking M these past 3 years." June took the note, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Father should return by tomorrow noon. You're welcome to wait in the bunkhouse if you'd like. Our foreman can show you there." "Much obliged," Yates nodded, expecting her to turn away, but she hesitated, her gaze drifting beyond him to the mountains. Except he noticed with curiosity, her eyes stopped short of the tallest peak that dominated the eastern skyline. She seemed to deliberately focus on the foothills, the valley, anywhere but that mountain. "Beautiful country," he commented, following her gaze. "That eastern peak has a particular majesty at sunset." June's expression changed instantly, a subtle hardening around her mouth, a tightening of her shoulders. "Supper will be sent to the bunkhouse shortly," she said, turning away. "Good evening, Mr. Irving." As June disappeared inside, Yates stood puzzled. He'd struck some nerve with his casual observation, though he couldn't imagine how. The foreman, a weathered man named Hank, appeared from around the barn and led him to the bunkhouse, but Yates found his thoughts returning to June Whitman and the mountain she refused to acknowledge. Over the next few days, as the ranchers negotiated terms for the cattle drive, Yates found himself watching June. She moved through the ranch with quiet efficiency, managing the household staff with gentle authority, joining her father for business discussions, where she displayed surprising knowledge of cattle prices and grazing rights. But whenever conversation turned to the mountains, particularly the eastern peak locals called Widow's Crown, she would find reason to excuse herself or change the subject. On the third evening, Yates found himself alone on the porch with Robert Whitman, a robust man in his 50s with the same blonde hair as his daughter, though his had faded to silver at the temples. "Your daughter runs a tight ship," Yates commented, sipping the whiskey Whitman had offered. Unusual to see a young woman so involved in ranch business. Whitman nodded, pride evident in his weathered face. June's been more than a daughter these past 5 years. She's been my right hand, had to grow up fast after her mother passed. He paused, swirling his drink. She has her mother's head for figures and her beauty, but thankfully not her restlessness. She's Sam's. Wary of the mountains, Yates ventured, watching Whitman's expression carefully. The older man's face darkened. Some places hold memories best left undisturbed. You're staying through to the drive, I hear. Maxwell speaks highly of your tracking skills. The subject change was deliberate, and Yates didn't press further. But that night, as he lay in his bunk staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of June's face when she looked at the valley, the way her eyes deliberately avoided Widow's Crown. The morning of departure for the cattle drive dawned clear and cold. Cowboys from both ranches gathered in the yard, checking cinches and loading supplies. Yates found himself near the main house, adjusting his saddlebags when June emerged carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "Trail provisions," she explained, handing it to him. "Father says you'll be scouting ahead of the main group." "Thank you, Miss Whitman." He accepted the package, noting the calluses on her slender hands, not the soft hands of an idle woman, but one who worked alongside her household. "I appreciate your hospitality these past days." June nodded, her gaze again drifting past him to the horizon, stopping just short of the mountain. Something compelled him to speak. "Miss Whitman, June, may I ask you something that might seem forward?" Her eyes snapped back to his, wariness evident. "You may ask." Yates gestured toward the eastern range. "I've noticed you never look at Widow's Crown. The mountain seems to trouble you somehow." Her face paled slightly, but she didn't immediately walk away as he half expected. Instead, she was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. "Some mountains cast long shadows, Mr. Irving," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and not all of them are made of stone." With that cryptic response, she turned and walked back toward the house, her spine straight as a pine. Yates watched her go, more intrigued than ever. There was a story there, one that had shaped her into this composed yet wounded young woman. As he mounted his horse and joined the gathering cowboys, he realized he wanted to know that story, to understand what had carved those shadows into her eyes. The cattle drive would last 3 weeks. For the first time in years, Yates found himself counting the days until his return, not away. The cattle drive north proved more challenging than anticipated. Unseasonal storms swept down from the mountains, swelling creeks into raging torrents and forcing the herds to seek shelter in narrow valleys. Rustlers struck twice, though the combined numbers of the Rocking M and Whitman Ranch hands discouraged them from taking more than a few head. Through it all, Yates found himself thinking of June Whitman. Her face would appear in his mind during long hours in the saddle, and at night by the campfire, he would gaze south toward Jackson's Hollow and wonder about the mystery of the mountain she avoided. "You're mighty quiet this drive," Maxwell Roberts commented one evening as they shared coffee by the fire. The cattle were settled for the night, and most of the men were already asleep in their bedrolls. "Something on your mind, Irving?" Yates hesitated, then decided truth was simpler than evasion. "Whitman's daughter, there's something about her that troubles me. She never looks at that eastern peak, Widow's Crown. Acts like it doesn't exist." Maxwell's weathered face grew serious. "That's not your mystery to unravel, son. Some hurts run too deep for outsiders to prod at." "I'm not looking to prod," Yates protested. "Just understand." "Understanding often comes with obligation," the older man warned. "You've kept yourself free of attachments since I've known you. Makes you a good cowhand. You can move on when the season changes. You start caring about someone's pain, you might find yourself unable to ride away so easily." The words struck uncomfortably close to Yates' core belief. He'd survived by staying unmoored, drifting where work took him. Caring about June Whitman's secrets meant caring about June herself, a complication he'd avoided for years. "I'm just curious is all," he said finally, draining his coffee. Maxwell gave him a knowing look. "Curiosity's killed more than cats out here, best remember that." But as they turned the herd toward home 2 weeks later, Yates knew his careful detachment had already been compromised. For the first time since his parents' death, he was riding toward something, or someone, rather than away. Jackson's Hollow appeared unchanged when they returned, though the first hints of autumn had begun to touch the aspen groves with gold. The cattle drive had been successful, fetching good prices at the northern railhead, and both ranches would prosper through the winter. Yates found himself lingering as the men dispersed, accepting Whitman's invitation to stay for a celebratory dinner rather than returning immediately to the Rocking M. He told himself it was the promise of a home-cooked meal after weeks of trail food, but his eyes searched for June as he cleaned up at the pump outside the bunkhouse. She appeared as the men gathered on the porch, wearing a dress of deep green that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was arranged more carefully than he remembered, with a ribbon woven through the golden strands. Something in her expression shifted when she saw him, a momentary softening before her composed mask returned. Dinner was a boisterous affair, with cowboys recounting tales of the drive, each story growing taller with each telling. June sat beside her father, occasionally joining the conversation but mostly observing. Yates noticed how the ranch hands treated her with a protective deference that went beyond respect for the boss's daughter. They cared for her, these rough men, in a way that suggested her story was known to them all. As the evening wound down, Yates found himself alone with June in the parlor, while her father bid farewell to the departing hands. She stood by the window gazing out at the starlit valley, her profile illuminated by lamplight. "The drive went well," he said, breaking the silence. "Your father's pleased." "Yes," she agreed. "We needed a good season. Last winter was difficult." Yates stepped closer, noting how she tensed slightly at his approach. "Miss Whitman, June, I've been thinking about our conversation before I left." Her hands clasped tightly before her. "It wasn't much of a conversation, Mr. Irving." "Yates," he corrected gently, "and no, it wasn't, but I'd like to have one if you're willing." She turned to face him fully, studying him with those sage-green eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. "Why?" The directness of her question caught him off guard, "Because I'd like to understand." "Understand what?" "You," he said simply. "What happened on that mountain that you can't bear to look at it?" June was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "Why does it matter to you?" It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself repeatedly during the cattle drive. The answer had come to him while watching the stars one night, feeling more alone among 20 men than he had in years. "Because I've spent my life avoiding looking at my own mountains," he admitted, "and I recognized something in you, something that made me think perhaps we both carry shadows we don't speak of." June's composure wavered for an instant. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "if you truly wish to know, meet me at the creek bend south of the property, morning before the day's work begins." Before he could respond, her father returned to the room, and the moment passed. But as Yates rode back to the bunkhouse that night, he felt both anticipation and trepidation. He'd lived by keeping his distance from others' pain, from connection itself. Tomorrow, he would deliberately step toward both. Dawn broke clear and cool, the mountains etched sharply against the pale sky. Yates had risen early, unable to sleep as his mind circled around what June might reveal. He rode south along the property line, following the creek until he reached the bend where cottonwoods created a small, sheltered grove. June was already there, mounted on a dappled mare. She wore a riding skirt of practical brown wool and a white blouse, her hair braided simply down her back. Without speaking, she nodded in greeting and turned her horse upstream. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following game trails that wound steadily upward into the foothills. The valley spread out below them, the ranch buildings becoming tiny with distance. Still, June kept her gaze resolutely forward, never looking toward Widow's Crown, though its massive presence loomed to their right. Finally, they reached a small plateau where a solitary cabin stood, its logs weathered gray by the elements. A stone chimney rose from the roof, though no smoke curled from it. Around the cabin, wildflowers grew in what once must have been a garden, now returned to the wilderness. June dismounted, tying her horse to a gnarled pine. Yates followed suit, watching as she stood before the cabin, her back to him. "My mother didn't die of fever like most folks in town believe," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "5 years ago she left my father for another man, a trapper who'd wintered in Jackson's Hollow. They came up here to this cabin he'd built." Yates remained silent, understanding that interruption would only make this harder for her. "I was 17, June continued, old enough to understand that my mother had been unhappy for years, young enough to feel betrayed by her leaving. Father was destroyed. He'd loved her since they were children back east." She turned slightly, enough that he could see her profile against the cabin. 3 months they lived up here. 3 months of scandal and whispers in town, of father drinking himself to sleep every night while I tried to keep the ranch running. She walked to the cabin's porch, her steps measured but reluctant. Then came the early blizzard, October, but it hit like January, the worst storm in memory, they said. Her voice had taken on a flat quality, as if she'd rehearsed this story many times. The trapper went out to check his lines. My mother waited 3 days before trying to make it down to the ranch for help. They found her body in the spring thaw, halfway down the mountain. They never found him. Yates felt the weight of her words, the years of pain compressed into those simple sentences. And the mountain reminds you. June nodded, finally turning to face him fully. Every day. Every time I look up, I see where she chose him over us, where she died alone in the snow, where my father's heart broke beyond repair. Her composure cracked slightly. The worst part is that I still love her, still miss her. How can you miss someone who abandoned you? The question hit Yates with unexpected force, echoing his own unspoken thoughts about his parents. Not that they had abandoned him by choice, but death had taken them all the same, leaving him to navigate a harsh world alone. I think, he said carefully, that love doesn't simply disappear because someone hurt you. It just gets complicated. June studied him as if seeing beyond his words. You speak from experience. It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. Raiders hit our homestead when I was 16. I was out hunting, came back to find everything gone, parents, home, future. For years, I was angry they'd sent me away that morning, angry they'd chosen to settle in dangerous territory, angry they'd left me alone. The admission surprised him. He'd never spoken of it so directly to anyone. But here, in this place of June's pain, his own seemed less threatening to acknowledge. So you wander, she said softly, never staying, never risking attachment. And you stay rooted, he countered. But keep your eyes averted from what hurt you. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Perhaps we're both hiding in our own ways. They stood in silence for a long moment, the mountain breeze stirring the wildflowers around them. Yates felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared wounds, different but equally deep. Thank you, he said finally, for trusting me with this. June looked past him toward the distant ranch. I've never brought anyone here before, not even father knows I come sometimes. Why me? The question had been building since her invitation the previous night. Her eyes met his directly. Because you ask not out of curiosity but understanding, and because, she hesitated, when you look at me, I feel like you're actually seeing me, not just the tragedy that happened to my family. The ride back down the mountain was quieter but less tense. They spoke of simpler things, the changing seasons, the successful cattle drive, the new foal born at the Whitman ranch during their absence. Yet beneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of connection neither had anticipated. As they neared the ranch, June finally spoke of what had been implicit in their sharing. Will you be moving on soon? Maxwell usually loses half his hands after the big drive. Yates had asked himself the same question throughout the morning. His pattern for years had been clear: finish a job, collect pay, move on before winter set in or connections grew too deep. The Rocking M had been his longest placement, and even there he'd maintained his distance from the other hands. I hadn't decided, he answered truthfully, though Maxwell mentioned keeping me on through winter to help break the new horses. June nodded, keeping her eyes on the trail. Jackson's Hollow isn't so bad in winter. The community comes together more. There are socials, even a Christmas dance at the schoolhouse. Was she inviting him to stay? The possibility warmed him more than he expected. I've never been much for dancing, he said. Neither have I, she admitted. Not since, she stopped herself, but he understood. Not since her mother left, not since scandal touched their family. As they reached the creek bend where they'd met that morning, June reined in her horse. The ranch was visible now, smoke rising from the chimney against the clear autumn sky. Behind them rose the mountains, including Widow's Crown with its distinctive peak. Maybe, Yates suggested carefully, we could both learn to look at mountains differently, not all at once, but a little at a time. June's gaze remained on the ranch, but something in her posture softened. Perhaps, she said, the single word holding more possibility than he'd allowed himself to consider in years. They parted at the ranch yard, June to her duties in the house, Yates to return to the Rocking M. But as he rode away, he found himself planning his return rather than his departure, a novel sensation that should have alarmed him, but instead felt like the first breath after too long underwater. Over the following weeks, as autumn painted the valley in russet and gold, Yates found reasons to ride to the Whitman ranch. Sometimes it was legitimate business between the ranches, other times transparent excuses that fooled no one, least of all June's father, who watched their growing attachment with a mixture of concern and hope. Each visit, each conversation with June, chipped away at the walls Yates had built around himself. He learned that she loved poetry and kept a small collection of books hidden beneath her practical ranch accounts. She discovered that he could whittle intricate figures from wood, a skill learned from his father that he'd continued in solitary camp nights. They shared memories both painful and precious, her mother teaching her to make sourdough bread, his father showing him how to read weather from cloud patterns. And gradually, they began to face their mountains. For June, it was allowing herself to glance at Widow's Crown without immediately looking away, acknowledging its presence in her life without letting it dominate her vision. For Yates, it was the harder task of imagining a future in one place, with connections that couldn't be severed by simply riding away. The first snow came early that year, dusting the valley in white and painting the mountains with a pure brilliance that took the breath away. Yates arrived at the Whitman ranch to find June on the porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her gaze deliberately turned toward Widow's Crown. "It looks different in the snow," she said as he approached. "Almost peaceful." "Beautiful," he agreed, though he was looking at her rather than the mountain, the way the cold had brought color to her cheeks, how snowflakes caught in her golden lashes. "Father's inside with Maxwell, discussing winter grazing arrangements," she said, still watching the mountain. "They'll be a while." Yates understood the implicit invitation and joined her on the porch. They stood side by side, their breaths forming small clouds in the crisp air. "I've been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence, "about staying through winter. Maxwell's offered me a permanent position as his foreman come spring." June turned to him, her expression carefully controlled. "That would be a good opportunity for you. The Rocking M is a fine ranch." "It is," he agreed, "though I find myself drawn elsewhere more often than not." Their eyes met, and the understanding that passed between them needed no words. June's careful composure softened, a genuine smile touching her lips. "The Christmas dance is in 3 weeks," she said. "You mentioned you don't dance, but perhaps—" "I'd be honored to escort you," Yates interrupted gently. "If you'd allow it." The smile that bloomed across her face was like sunrise after the darkest night. "I'd like that very much." That evening, as Yates rode back to the Rocking M, he realized with startling clarity that he was no longer the man who had arrived in Jackson's Hollow months ago. The careful distance he'd maintained from life, from connection, from possibility itself, had diminished with each conversation shared with June, each story exchanged, each glance toward mountains they'd both feared to face. The Christmas dance transformed the simple schoolhouse into a wonderland of pine boughs, ribbon, and candlelight. The entire community gathered, ranch hands, shopkeepers, farmers, and their families, all dressed in their finest clothes, the usual social divisions temporarily set aside in celebration of the season. June wore a dress of deep blue that must have been saved for special occasions, her golden hair arranged with small white flowers that Yates later learned she'd grown in pots by the kitchen window. When he arrived at the Whitman ranch to escort her and her father to the dance, the sight of her descending the stairs momentarily robbed him of speech. "You look beautiful," he finally managed, acutely aware of Robert Whitman watching their interaction with paternal scrutiny. "Thank you," she replied, a becoming blush coloring her cheeks. "You clean up quite well yourself." Indeed, Yates had made efforts beyond his usual appearance. His best shirt was freshly pressed, his boots polished to a shine, and he'd splurged on a new vest of dark green wool from the general store. His normally unruly hair was neatly combed, though a rebellious lock already threatened to fall across his forehead. At the schoolhouse, the whispers that followed their entrance were impossible to miss. June Whitman hadn't attended a social event since her mother's scandal and death. That she arrived on Yates Irving's arm sent a clear message about her feelings and about her willingness to step back into community life. "People are staring," she murmured as they entered. "Let them," Yates replied, covering her hand where it rested on his arm. "They'll find something new to gossip about by next week." June's tension eased slightly, probably Mrs. Henderson's Christmas punch. She always adds too much whiskey, and someone always makes a spectacle of themselves. The casual joke, so unexpected from usually serious June, made him laugh. The sound drew more looks, but neither of them minded as they made their way through the crowded room. True to their confessions, neither was much practiced at dancing. Their first attempt at a waltz involved several missteps and near collisions with other couples. But by the third dance they had found their rhythm, moving together with growing confidence. During a break while musicians tuned their instruments, Yates brought June a cup of the infamous punch. They stood near the doorway, watching the community celebrate around them. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said. "It can't have been easy, knowing people would talk." June sipped her punch thoughtfully. "It was easier with you beside me. And perhaps it's time I stopped hiding from life because of what happened. Mother's choices were her own. They don't have to define my future." The insight struck Yates profoundly. "My parents didn't choose to leave me," he said slowly, "but I've been letting their absence dictate my choices all the same. Always moving on, never allowing myself to care too deeply about anyone or any place." June's eyes met his. "And now?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Before Yates could answer, a commotion at the main door drew their attention. A man had entered, snow dusting his heavy coat, his face weathered beyond his years. The room had gone oddly quiet, conversations halting mid-sentence as people turned to stare. Robert Whitman stood from his chair by the punch table, his face draining of color. "Carlson," he said, the single word carrying years of barely contained fury. Yates felt June stiffen beside him, her cup slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers to spill across the wooden floor. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow, feeling her tremble beneath his touch. "It's him," she whispered, her voice hollow with shock. "The trapper, Thomas Carlson." The revelation hit Yates like a physical blow. The man June's mother had left with the man presumed dead in the blizzard had returned to Jackson's Hollow on Christmas Eve, 5 years after disappearing. The community stood frozen, caught between holiday celebration and impending confrontation. Robert Whitman moved forward, his hands clenched at his sides, grief and rage warring in his expression. Carlson held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not here for trouble, Whitman, just passing through, didn't know about the dance." "You weren't found with her," Robert said, his voice raw. "We searched all spring." The trapper's weathered face showed genuine regret. "I was trapped on the other side of the ridge. By the time I could get back to the cabin, she was gone. Followed her trail until another storm hit. By spring thaw, I'd been forced north." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I heard about finding her when I reached Montana. Knew there was nothing I could say that would help, so I stayed away." June stepped forward, drawing every eye in the room. "Yet here you are." Carlson looked at her, recognition dawning. "June, you've grown up." His gaze traveled between her and Yates, noting their proximity. Something like approval flickered across his features. "I'm truly just passing through. Heading to California, thought I owed it to stop to say," he trailed off, apparently realizing no words could possibly suffice. The tension in the room was unbearable. The Christmas celebration hung suspended as past tragedy collided with present moment. Yates watched June, ready to support whatever she decided to do, confront the man, flee the scene, or simply stand her ground. What she did surprised everyone, himself included. June walked forward until she stood before Carlson, her father just steps away, the entire community watching in stunned silence. "She loved you," June said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Enough to leave us. Enough to die trying to save you." She took a deep breath. "For years, I couldn't understand how she could make that choice, couldn't forgive her for it." Carlson's weathered face showed his pain plainly. "Catherine was the finest woman I ever knew. She deserved better than dying alone on that mountain." "Yes," June agreed, her composure remarkable. "She did, but her choices were her own, as are mine." She glanced back at Yates, drawing strength from his presence. "Safe travels to California, Mr. Carlson. I hope you find what you're looking for there." The simple words, devoid of both forgiveness and condemnation, seemed to release something in the room. Robert Whitman remained rigid but made no move toward the trapper. After a moment, Carlson nodded, understanding the dismissal for what it was. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly, then turned and walked back into the snowy night. In his wake, the community stood uncertain, the festive mood shattered. Then Maxwell Roberts, with unexpected sensitivity, nodded to the musicians. "I believe we were in the middle of a celebration," he said firmly. "Mrs. Henderson, I think we all could use a bit more of your excellent punch. The music resumed, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Conversations slowly rekindled around the room. Robert Whitman accepted a glass from Maxwell, his hands shaking slightly but his back straight with dignity. Yates moved to June's side, concerned about the strain of the confrontation. Are you all right? She looked up at him, her eyes clearer than he'd ever seen them. No, she said honestly, but I will be. For the first time in 5 years, I think I truly will be. Understanding dawned on Yates. In that moment of facing Coulson, June had confronted her mountain directly, not just glancing at it, but standing before it and acknowledging its place in her life without letting it dominate her future. Would you like to leave? He asked gently. June considered this, then shook her head. No, I'd like to dance again if you're willing. She glanced at her father, who gave her a small nod, his own silent acknowledgement of her strength. As they moved back onto the dance floor, Yates realized the question June had asked earlier, and now remained unanswered. But as they found their rhythm again, moving together through the crowded schoolhouse, he knew what his answer would be. Later that evening, as they stood on the Whitman porch beneath a canopy of winter stars, he finally gave it voice. I'm staying, he said simply, not just for the winter, not just for the foreman position. I'm staying because for the first time since I lost my parents, I've found something worth putting down roots for. June's eyes reflected the starlight as she looked up at him. Roots can be vulnerable things, she warned softly. Storms come, seasons change. They do, he agreed, taking her hands in his. But roots can also grow deeper, stronger through adversity. My parents taught me to survive. You've reminded me how to live. The kiss that followed was gentle, a promise exchanged beneath the winter sky. When they parted, June turned slightly, deliberately looking toward Widow's Crown, its snow-covered peak gleaming in the moonlight. It really is beautiful, she said quietly. I'd forgotten that. Yates followed her gaze, seeing the mountain through new eyes, not as a symbol of loss or fear, but as part of the landscape that had brought them together. It is, he agreed. And so is this valley, so is the life we could build here. Her fingers tightened around his. I'd like that, she whispered, very much. Spring came late to Jackson's Hollow that year, but when it arrived, it brought changes beyond the greening of the valley. Yates had indeed stayed through winter, dividing his time between his duties at the Rocking M and courting June, with a dedication that became the subject of gentle teasing from cowboys at both ranches. By April, when the last snow had melted from the valley floor and wildflowers began to carpet the meadows, he had saved enough to purchase a small parcel of land adjoining the Whitman property. With Robert's blessing and Maxwell's understanding, Yates began building a house there, nothing grand but solid and well-crafted, with large windows facing both the valley and the mountains. June visited the construction site daily, offering suggestions about the placement of the kitchen garden or the width of the front porch. Together they planted saplings that would someday grow into shade trees, their roots intertwining beneath the soil much as their lives had begun to intertwine above it. On a perfect June morning, with the mountains standing witness and the community gathered in support, they were married beneath an arch of early summer roses in the Whitman ranch yard. June wore her mother's dress, carefully altered and adorned with fresh flowers. Yates wore a new suit, only slightly uncomfortable in its formality. Their vows, written together during long winter evenings, spoke not of perfect happiness, but of weathering storms side by side, of facing mountains rather than avoiding them, of building something that could withstand the harsh realities of frontier life, because it was founded on understanding of both joy and sorrow. After the celebration, as twilight gathered and the last guests departed, they stood together on the porch of their new home. Widow's Crown was visible from where they stood, its silhouette softened by the evening light. I still miss her sometimes, June admitted, leaning against her husband's shoulder. I think I always will. As it should be, Yates replied, his arm secure around her waist. I still miss my parents. But the missing doesn't define us anymore. June smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the first emerging stars. No, it doesn't. We've found something stronger. As darkness fell completely, they remained on the porch, watching as lights appeared in distant ranch houses across the valley. Neither felt compelled to go inside just yet, content to share this moment of perfect understanding beneath the vast Wyoming sky. Their mountains remained, Widow's Crown standing tall on the horizon, the memories of loss each carried within. But now they faced them together, no longer averting their gaze from pain or possibility, and in doing so, they had found what both had once believed impossible on the frontier. A love that didn't deny the harshness of their world but provided shelter within it, roots strong enough to weather any storm, and the courage to look toward horizons once feared, now embraced.